Welcome into the Thursday edition of the 14. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Barry Allen joins me. Got a very special guest today. He's John Wilkerson, the voice of the Tennessee Volunteers for baseball. John, we are very much looking forward to this conversation. It has been a wild ride. You have seen a lot of baseball in Knoxville. Welcome to the show. I don't think you've seen anything like you have seen this year, however, in many ways.
Well, first of all, very much appreciate it, and it's great to talk with you and with Barry. And it really has been as unique a season as I've ever experienced, just for all that's gone into Tennessee getting to this point. Preseason, they were picked third in the Eastern Division. They wind up winning their first division crown since 1997. Along the way, they've just found one new way, or a different way, seemingly, when the odds were stacked against them to find a win. 7 walk-off wins. I believe only one team, and I don't know who that team is, has more this year in college baseball. But it has been a wild ride, but it also has been as enjoyable as ever.
John, this may or may not have been a surprise to you and to Tony Vitello and the Tennessee team. 15-2 record last year. You kind of felt like when COVID came, Tennessee kind of had something going, and then 48-16 this year. Realistically, where did you see this Tennessee team as the season began, with amid all the COVID and pandemic related activities that we had? Where did you see this team as the year began?
I thought that it might have difficulty matching the fast start that we saw last year. You lost 3 guys in the draft and a couple of others signed as free agents when it wasn't but 5 rounds. And to lose a top talent like Garrett Crochet, and then also say goodbye to a couple of really good outfielders in Alaric Solari and Zach Daniels, that it was going to be perhaps a bit of an uphill climb just to get yourself settled and to find your footing. But as we saw with the opening trip to Georgia Southern, Tennessee won the first 2 games by identical scores, but one of those situations where it was vastly different games. They set the pace in the first one. They had to rally for the second one, and then they won an extra inning. And it just seems like from that point, Liam Spence hit a grand slam to separate from Georgia Southern in that last one. And so from that point on, there's just been a belief and the practice of being able to get the necessary play in almost every instance that they've needed it. And it's come from so many different parts, whether it be on the mound or in the batter's box or in the field. This is a team where I think the sum is greater than its parts, because I don't think you have an otherworldly talent like Crochet who's going to be a first-round pick, but I do think you have a lot of guys that work really, really hard. And I thought it might have a chance to really get off the rails early, because after Tennessee won on the road that opening weekend, they come home and they host Indiana State. And Jackson Leaf, who was the only pitcher that earned any preseason All-American nod on the team, he pitches to his 3rd batter in his home start, and he's done for the season. It was a hamstring. And all of a sudden you go from having this guy that you think is going to be the anchor of your staff to not having him at all. And so what we have seen is just Tennessee settle into a very, very steady lineup. I mean, I can't think of the last time on a weekend that we saw anything different from the order that Tony Vitello has essentially ridden throughout SEC play. And he had the exact same rotation all 10 weekends, where it was Chad Dallas in Game 1, Will Heflin in Game 2, and Blade Tidwell in the finale. So this has been, I think, the easiest season for any head coach to fill out a lineup card, because it has been so consistent. And I think that's what has allowed Tennessee to just find a way when the odds had been against them.
John, the way that you just summarized that team is the way that I've summarized it a lot this year on both sides. But I want to ask you particularly on offense, because they lose those 2 outfielders to the draft. And I'm going, man, they really took that step up in 19, getting to a regional final. And then last year was going so well, and then the pandemic strikes it down. And I'm going, it might be a little tough for them, because last year might have been that next step year, but then they lose those bats to, as you said, a shortened draft. So I think Tennessee got disproportionately hit in the draft, which that puts you in a really hard position going into 2020, 2021. Then you look up and Connor Pavoloni gets hurt. Max Ferguson didn't hit quite the way that I think a lot of people thought he would hit, say the first 2.5 months. He's gotten a lot better, but there was just a lot against him offensively, and I just marvel at what they have been able to do with that lineup. I think Liam Spence was the most underrated player in the league all year, but I've just marveled at what they've been able to do to reassemble things. I mean, it's not like they were Florida or LSU or Vanderbilt where they were one of these brand programs where they just reload. How were they able to do that with their offense and just perform at this level to where I think you could probably say that's probably the best offense in the league?
Well, one thing that has been a constant refrain is the fact that Coach Vitello didn't want anybody to be try and do anything that wasn't part of them and their makeup. And he thinks that perhaps in the early going, that might have been the case, that you had some individuals that, and whether it was the preseason spotlight that found them as either all-conference or preseason All-American status, because you had 4 other guys, Jake Rucker, Max Ferguson, Connor Pavoloni were among those. And then lo and behold, you have some guys that, as you just mentioned, were struggling just a little bit. He thinks it took a while for some just to take a deep breath, relax, and just be comfortable in who they are and what their strengths are, because that's all he ever asks of anybody. Just do what we ask you to do. You don't have to do anything more. And I think that's what's allowed guys like Max Ferguson to come on after some uphill struggles. Connor Pavoloni has really been a difference maker in the batter's box once you get past, I guess, about the first half of the SEC season. And I guess he might have actually had that first real spark against Florida. And so it really was something to watch. Now, in the meantime, you just had guys that found a way to make a play. It has been kind of a hot hand situation. Tennessee, for just the second time in its program history, has 4 guys in double-digit home runs. And if Drew Gilbert can come up with one more, it'll be the first time ever that Tennessee's had 5. It's the second most home runs as a team in any Tennessee baseball team before. So I just think that you've had guys that have stepped in to step up at the perfect time, and then perhaps go back to maybe a battle for consistency. Luke Lipsius leads the team in home runs. It's been pockets for Luke. He had home runs in each game in the series against Kentucky after his brother threw out the first pitch for game 1, which was really cool. Andre, who's with the Tigers organization. But I just think that's kind of been a trademark of this team. You don't count on the same guy every game, but you have the potential for anybody to step in and be that hero. And so for them to have 4 guys in double-digit home runs, which has only happened once before, as I mentioned, I just think this is a team that finds a way, that somebody just steps into that role. Jordan Beck has led the team in home runs and runs batted in, but right now it's going back and forth as Gilbert has taken over the team lead in RBI. So you just have had contributors 1 to 9 in this very consistent lineup. Evan Russell, of course, had just monster games against LSU and Vanderbilt, with becoming the first Vol to ever have 2 free home run games in his career. And that helped Tennessee sweep the Tigers back in week 2, gave Tennessee a chance to win the Vanderbilt series in week 5. So it really has been something to see, because you have those lineups where if you can get this one guy out, you're in great shape. Tennessee hasn't been that kind of a lineup this year.
John, I think one of the most memorable moments was the Vanderbilt series when they have a walk-on left fielder. I think everybody knows this story right now. Evan Russell hits 3 home runs, hits a big one to win that game late. And I talked to a friend of mine who was there. I said, what was that like? He said it was almost like going to a football game where Tennessee gets a big stop on 3rd down or scores a touchdown with a minute left to win the game. He said it was that type of atmosphere. And I watched the Wright State game too. Everybody's seen the highlights of that. It just seems like that crowd has really taken to baseball, and there's just an electricity in that stadium that I think would have been difficult to predict a couple of years ago.
Very much so. And I think it is a testament to the hard work and the good work that's been done by Tony Vitello and his staff, because he's been so incredibly transparent from the moment he took over the program. He wasn't afraid to talk about making the NCAA tournament, and first the SEC tournament. That was kind of you would think that would be the first target because Tennessee hasn't been a consistent contributor and or participant in Hoover over the last few years, over the last several years. But it wasn't. The goal isn't to make Hoover. The goal is to make the NCAA. And in that first year, Tennessee goes from winning 7 SEC games the year before. They go into Columbia, Missouri, and if they win the series, they make the SEC tournament. They had won 11 conference games. And so that had exceeded everyone's expectations. They got a win in Game 2 against the Tigers, and Missouri won the last one, so they took that final spot in Hoover. But Tennessee finished that season with a winning record. And, again, Coach just doesn't shy away from his own expectations of not just making it to the NCAA tournament, but also making a run. And then that's why I think you were able to see in year 2 them climb to 40 wins to get to the NCAA tournament for the first time since 2005 in 2019. And it really would have been something to see just how good that 2020 team might have been. Let's see, at one point, that team got off to such a great start offensively that they had more home runs than runs allowed as a staff.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of got switched a little bit as we approached conference play and that weekend where everything shut down. But that was the good start that they were off to. I think they led the nation in runs scored at that point in time after 17 games. So that really wouldn't have been neat to see. But I also think the fact that there was such an appreciation for what was lost in 2020 that they focused on, it was a very simple mantra, and that was play all 56. He said you can't make up for lost time, you can't get back what was lost, but you can certainly show that you appreciate and you're determined to make the most of every opportunity you get this year. Tennessee was the only team in Hoover that played all 56. Texas A&M was the other one, and in the conference that did it. They didn't make it this year to the SEC tournament. So it was, he said, I'm sorry not to have more lofty goals, but if after playing 56 games, we're in a position to make the NCAA tournament, then we will. And but I just think that first of all, being the target, had everybody locked in the fall to do everything they possibly could. And you had guys that just worked so hard, whether it was to be a better defensive player like we saw with Beck in the games he's made in right field and Evan Russell in left, and even Gilbert in center for the difference they can make in covering all the real estate. But I say all of that to say that when you have that kind of connection with the fan base, because you have been so, one, accessible and available, and saying we want to be the best we can be and be a part of Tennessee's athletic success, I think that is what led into, first of all, the Florida series the weekend before Vanderbilt. You had the Gators come in preseason number 1, and that was the first really big challenge because while LSU is LSU, you opened at Georgia, you won that series. Bulldogs are a young team, and then you have LSU also going through a big youth movement, some outstanding young talent for the Tigers. And then you go to Alabama, which we know it's been a struggle for the Crimson Tide, but they were able to get back to the SEC tournament for the first time in like 5 years and on to the NCAA tournament. So Florida was that first really big opponent. And you won the first 2 games. You led the last one 6-3 before they rallied to get the last one and salvage one before heading back to Gainesville. But then that set the stage for what was the biggest on-campus ranking matchup for any Tennessee men's program. It was number 3 versus number 2, with Vanderbilt being number 2. You had a number of those when it came to Pat Summitt and the Lady Vols, where it was 1 versus 3, 1 versus 2, and so on. But this was the largest on-campus meeting in terms of ranked teams squaring off in Knoxville that had ever taken place. And you also had the first step forward in terms of going to about 50% capacity at Lindsey Nelson Stadium. So you had more fans than had been in the stadium to this point in the season, and they were really jacked up. Everybody knew about Vanderbilt, a team that had also been number 1. You always know about Kumar Rocker and Jack Leiter with what they've meant to that team and how good they've been. But after Vanderbilt won 5-0 in the opener, Tennessee gave itself a chance. Connor Pavoloni hit a home run, followed by Evan Russell. He hit a home run, and it really was something special after that because that was off of Jack Leiter, and then Russell got a second one. And while Vanderbilt still had the lead, it was, I believe, 4. I'm trying to remember. the score eludes me, but anyhow, it was a reliever that came in. You had the bases loaded, and you are late in the game. And when he steps into another one, and it comes up with his second hat trick of the season, it was simply an eruption that you might necessarily not have been expecting. But it was a fan base that was ready to celebrate. It was a huge moment for Evan Russell as that grand slam flipped the script, and Tennessee was able to get that win. Vanderbilt got the finale, but just everything that built up to that moment in terms of this season, the growth of the program, the development of Tennessee baseball, I think it all just came to a head right then, right there. And it really was that moment where, yeah, Tennessee does belong, and Tennessee knows it can compete with anybody.
I want to talk about the pitching staff for a minute, because the Vols don't have first, second team all SEC guys. They don't have the arms that, when we talk about the lighters, the rockers, and all the arms in the league that come up in that conversation. But Tennessee has something that I think that is just essential for deep postseason runs. They've got a lot of guys who pitch well, who are consistent, and who go deep into games. And you look at Tidwell, Hundley, Heflin, Dallas, McLaughlin, Redmond Walsh, Camden Sewell, Kirby Cannell, sometimes Elijah Pleasance. I think people tend to underestimate. You don't necessarily have to have one or two studs as much as you need 8 or 9 guys who can go deep into games. And it just seems like no matter the situation, they have a guy fresh that they can plug in, who can give them a couple innings at the time. And I think that's what makes them really hard to beat on the mound. I just want your thoughts on that pitching staff as a whole and how they've been able to cobble this together.
Well, it starts with who they have leading the way. The first hire for Tony Vitello was Frank Anderson, somebody who had been a head coach and is also renowned for being, as Tony would say, the best pitching coach in the country. So that was his first hire, and then it was his strength coach, Quentin Eberhardt. But to have Frank be able to work with and develop these arms, as we got to week 9 in the Arkansas series, I asked Coach, I said, what does it mean to the team to have Chad Dallas, Will Heflin, and Blade Tidwell start every single series in that order once we got to conference play, 1, 2, and 3? And he said, I don't know. He says, I've never been a part of a team, whether it was as a player, as an assistant, or as a head coach, that had that kind of consistency, because there are so many different things that come up. It was the Georgia State series pre-conference where Dallas just had a bit of a catch in his back, and they thought there's just no reason to trot him out there. Heflin moved into that spot for that game 1 start, and that's when they realized that he could be somebody who was a part of the weekend rotation. He went 7, tied his career high with 8 strikeouts, and that kind of set everything in motion, that when Dallas came back the very next week, that's when we saw the start of Dallas, Heflin, and Tidwell. But first of all, it's just the confidence in each of those individuals to just go out and get the job done that gives them that freedom to use somebody who is kind of, don't want to say a poor man's Kevin Kopp, but Tennessee's Swiss Army knife in Sean Hundley, because Hundley has matched the school record for appearances this year with 32. Only 2 others had ever made 30 appearances. Todd Helton made 30 in 1995, and Scott Drucker made 32 in 2004. But to have Sean Hundley, and one of the things they did earlier on that they haven't been doing as much of late, is you had Chad Dallas start game 1. Sean Hundley was going to be the man out of the bullpen, the first one out. And they have been a great Tennessee tandem in so many instances. And then game 2 was going to be Heflin. It was going to be McLaughlin. And then you got to game 3, and that would be Tidwell and likely Redmond Walsh or Camden Sewell. That one was a little bit more of just who's available and who's ready to go. But so many times we've seen Hundley go in game 1 and come back in game 3. In fact, Hundley, that LSU weekend, he got saved in game 1, and he was the winner in both games 2 and 3 same day, because they had a suspended game that they finished on Sunday, and then they had the finale, which actually went 7 innings, but an extra 8th inning. But Sean Hundley factored in all 3, had the save and then 2 wins. So they've just had guys that they know they can count on. And Kirby Connell, as you were mentioning, is somebody who's been very good for them in key moments as another left-hander out of the pen. But it just comes down to the confidence they have and what they've seen in terms of those contributions from those individuals. Sewell might be the one that is the kind of shining the brightest right now for what he did down at the SEC tournament. 6 scoreless innings against Florida as he set the tone, making the start. I think it was just his 3rd of the season. And then he came in with some key relief moments against Liberty to help the Volunteers finish off game 2 in that regional when it looked like they were about to rally. Tennessee led 7-0, and then here came the Flames, and Camden Sewell was able to finish things and really limit what they did the rest of the way. So they just have, again, a great belief in so many different guys, and they're not afraid to use a guy for just an inning here or perhaps stretch him out a little bit longer than you would expect. But it has been the consistency of those 3 weekend starters as well as the ability of Sean Hunley just to make himself available that has led the way for Tennessee on the mound.
John, who is the guy, and I know they're all really good arms, but right now, who is the guy that, like, if you're Tennessee, you feel the best with the ball in his hand with the game on the line, whether that's a starter to start a big game or somebody coming in at the end, but, like, who is their most effective guy right now that you would least want to face as an opponent?
I think right now it would be Tidwell. Just for the freshman, he went through a patch. He was so big for Tennessee in that opening SEC weekend because he really shut down Georgia after the Bulldogs had an emotional win in the bottom of the 9th in Game 2 to even the series. And so for him to make his first conference start the way he did, and then it wasn't long after that, as so many first-year players can kind of be their own worst enemy, but he started perhaps thinking a little too much about everything as he was doing it, rather than get out there, throw, don't think. He kind of created a difficult path for himself, and they were able to get him back on track. And when you look at what he's done essentially over the last 6 weeks, it's been remarkable. And this is probably somebody that if the draft is longer than 5 rounds, may not ever make it to Tennessee. He's that kind of good. But he did make it to this staff, and he has been, I think, their most consistent performer over the end of the SEC schedule and the start of the postseason. So I think right now, I mean, you love what Chad Dallas brings you, and that's just going to be sheer determination and effort in every game 1. And when he comes off the mound, he becomes the loudest voice in the dugout. And then Will Heflin, the fact that this is his 5th year with the program, he went through senior day 2 years ago, which was really crazy because he thought it was time to move on to the next stage of life. When he came off the mound after working for Tennessee in that NCAA regional in Charlotte, he was kind of saying his farewells. And but then had the opportunity to come back and tore his ACL, and then was able to rehab that to a degree where he was just about ready to get back out on the mound when COVID shut everything down. And since you were given the extra year, I mean, within the last year, Will Heflin has earned his master's degree. He had already earned his bachelor's, got married, and has been Tennessee's Game 2 starter throughout the SEC season. He said, bar none, it is the best year of his life. And so you've just had guys that have filled very specific roles. But when you talk about who is the hot hand right now, I believe it is the freshman from Loretta, Tennessee, Slade Tidwell, that is pitching the best for the Volunteers in the rotation.
John, I want to touch on Heflin a little bit. I apologize. I was away for a minute, some technical difficulties, but this is a guy that incredible story as you're talking about, but he made 12 SEC starts here, which means he started twice in the SEC tournament, and he did not record a win in any of those games. He was 0-2 in 12 starts, but Tennessee had success with him on the mound, kind of like Dylan Smith at Alabama. As a matter of fact, they matched up against each other during the regular season. Neither guy got a win, which was ironic because that's how kind of the way they both pitched this year. But just for him, where the wins might not have come for him, he did keep Tennessee in the games, and Tennessee won a lot of games that he pitched. What, I guess that maturity of being a 5th or 6th year guy able to come back, just talk about him and his role and how that has helped Tennessee's pitching staff.
Well, in the few instances where Tennessee dropped the opener to a series, Tennessee won every next game that they had to in order to give themselves just a chance to win the weekend. They did lose the series against Vanderbilt, and they lost the series against Arkansas. But Will Heflin, just his mindset is, I think, what was so important in those instances. And while his numbers won't overwhelm you, he did get the win against Liberty in the regional final, that evened his record at 3-3. But he is somebody who is just so determined to make a difference that more times than not, he would pitch you and put you in a position to win. And then you needed either the lineup to rally or have guys come in and pick up where he left off out of the bullpen. But I just think that it starts with the will, pun intended, that Will Heflin has just to help this team succeed as best he can. And so I do think that, again, while his numbers aren't going to be anything that separates him as an all-conference performer or anything that would strike fear in the hearts of the opponent, he is somebody that's going to battle and give you everything that he has. And so I just think that to have that in the few instances where Tennessee did not win the first game of a weekend, I thought that was job one. Because to me, as a team, I think it's really impressive. They did not lose back-to-back games to any one SEC opponent this year. In fact, they only lost back-to-back games, one opponent. That was 2 9-inning games in a doubleheader of a 4-game weekend against Indiana State. Sycamores won game 1 and game 2. Tennessee won on Friday and won on Sunday to even the series. But for a team to be able to, one, set aside the emotions that go with winning as much as they have, but also be able to push to the side and out of the picture any frustrations of an emotional letdown that might have been a series opener where you didn't perform well, as, for instance, they jumped out to the early lead against Alabama, but the Crimson Tide really put it on both Dallas and Hundley to get that first game, that Tennessee needed to come back with something strong in game 2. And that's what Will Heflin did, put them in a position to win. Tennessee did, and did the same thing against Vanderbilt, did the same thing against Arkansas. And I just think that knowing that you're going to have somebody out there that you know is putting every ounce of his effort into it is something that's very easy for the rest of the team to follow suit.
And I think Will Heflin kind of symbolizes this Tennessee team. Here's a guy that he didn't win an SEC, had no wins in the SEC in 12 starts, but yet here he is on the mound, game 3 of the regional to clinch the regional at home against Liberty to take Tennessee to the Super Regional, gets that win, his first since March the 5th, way back when. But here's this guy, they trust him, they believe in him, and I think that kind of embodies this Tennessee team with, hey, this is Will Heflin, this is our guy, and here he is out on the mound on Sunday to beat Liberty to put Tennessee into the Super Regionals.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is such an apt description because, as you mentioned, he did not have a win when it came to SEC action, but he certainly gave Tennessee the opportunity to win. And so a lot of those were rally games, whether it be Evan Russell with the grand slam and his 3rd home run against Vanderbilt, or Max Ferguson in the walk-off shot in the bottom of the 9th to even the series against top-ranked Arkansas. It was just the ability for not only Heflin, but also those relievers that came in game 2. Tennessee's just one of those teams that you can't assume that the game is in hand, even though you have the lead into the 7th, into the 8th, and as Wright State found out, even into the bottom of the 9th. It's just, that's been one of the really neat things about it, because Tennessee just finds a way. As I mentioned earlier, it's not the same guy that you've had to depend on, that you sure hope that you get to the stretch of the lineup so you see this guy or that guy. Now, there probably was a weekend or two where there were some segments of the lineup that carried the day, but there just hasn't been that one performer that if an opponent was able to get them out, then they were on their way to a win. I just think that that's something where the belief and the culture that's been established by Tony Vitello really comes to the forefront, because when he arrived, and even before then, we saw with Dave Serrano, who I thought did the very best he could at the University of Tennessee. You had a team that would look good in the pre-conference, but then as soon as you looked across and say the middle of March, I think the roster had the unfortunate reaction that, wow, that's an SEC team over there. And that was one of the things that stood out to Tony Vitello in his first year. It's like, well, you're an SEC team as well, and we're going to go out there and we're just going to play until we can't play anymore. And I think from that moment on, and you have 4 guys on this roster, not only do you have Will Heflin, but you also have Peter Kay, you have Redmond Walsh, and you have Luke Lipsius that were on the roster before Tony Vitello and his staff took over. And they can just show you and tell you what it's been like to just have that confidence grow, the belief grow. And I think any time that you're taking on either a team that you might think is better than you or a team that you know that you're better than, I think it starts with the confidence and the ability to get the job done. And I think that is, I think the mental aspect of this team is as strong as I've seen in quite some time.
John, can you talk about Liam Spence for a minute? I have felt like he has been their best player most of the year. I know he has tailed off a little bit lately. Ironically, the pop has started to come for him as the on-base percentage has trailed off a little bit. But the kid was having an on-base percentage of, I think, .520 or so heading into the last weekend of the SEC regular season, which is just out of this world. It's unreal. He's doing that while he's playing shortstop, although I know he was hurt for a while. I know this kid's from Australia. He's, from what I have been told, just one of the most likable kids you can be around. I just want you to give our audience more background on Liam Spence, if you would, please.
Yeah, he followed 2 older brothers over to the United States. His older brother played San Diego Padres for a couple of seasons, but baseball was something that his family took to, and he has, as I mentioned, followed in his brother's footsteps. But he makes his way over to Central Arizona, and he plays there for a couple of seasons. Tennessee had him visit, and it just so happens that in Max Ferguson's freshman year, he had gotten hurt and had been lost for the season with a wrist injury against Kentucky in Lexington. And so while everybody had scattered to go play summer ball, he was still in town. And so Liam was arriving, and they said, Max, would you mind go picking him up at the airport? And so he did that, and he hadn't even gotten back to campus when he had already called Ross Kivett, the volunteer assistant, to say, Liam's going to stay with me. And so they became best friends, and you can see that chemistry on the field with the double play combination that is Spence at short and Ferguson at second. But Liam is just one of those rare individuals that he is as good a player as Tennessee has, and he is as hard a worker as Tennessee has. And when you're a coach, if your hardest worker can be one of your best players, that's always a great tone to set and great example for the rest of the team to follow. It's been interesting that with, remote broadcasting and things like that, I got into the habit this season of, I do an afternoon sports talk show in Knoxville. And so I would just go to the stadium for the midweek games, and I would do my part of the show from the press box. So I would get to see who was out in the field working early, and to see Liam Spence go out to his position at short, and he would set down a towel, and he would get down on one knee, and he would just have Ross Kivett or Tony Vitello just short hop balls into his glove defensively. And he would just work on that for a good segment, and then he would move to another portion of the infield. So he was getting a feel for the different kinds of turf as Tennessee went to all turf, but there is a different feel to the infield as opposed to the outfield. He was just working on different areas and on the, on just different scoops with the short hop. And I don't think there's any question that his determination to be the best he can defensively and in all facets of the game led to him being the shortstop on the all-defensive team in this year's Southeastern Conference. But he's just that kind of a hard worker. He usually works with Tony Vitello when it comes to his time in the cage, and he was having a phenomenal season. And not that 350 is anything to sneeze at, but as you pointed out, what he was doing in terms of his on-base percentage as well as his batting average, he was flirting with 400 with his batting average, was over 500 with his on-base percentage. That tailed off when Tennessee got into that second half stretch, kind of towards the finish line of the regular season. But he has started to come around. The walks have come back, as I think he's either at or near the top of the conference when it comes to walks drawn as an individual. But it's just his ability to get on base. He was slowed a bit by a hamstring injury that took him out of the field defensively. He was the designated hitter for Tennessee on the weekends, and then finally got back into the field in that Vanderbilt series. It was interesting because he went into Tony Vitello's office and he said, I want to get back on the field. I think I give us the strongest presence defensively at short when I'm on the field. And he said, well, get the lead late this weekend, and that'll happen. And so when Evan Russell gave Tennessee the lead with that grand slam and flipped the script on the Commodores, who came out of the DH spot to take over in the field, that was Liam Spence. And Sean Hunley was actually in the on-deck circle at one point in time in that game, because once you have the DH go back in the field, the pitcher hit. But Hunley did not have to hit. Tennessee was able to get the necessary outs and win that key second game. But Liam's just been that kind of a hard worker. Such a great example, a fantastic teammate, and just a wonderful personality to have on the team. Can keep it light, can keep people laughing, but he's also the hardest worker, or as hard a worker as Tennessee has on the roster.
Keep it in that Liam Spence kind of theme. You go back to the third game of the season at Georgia Southern, you're not sure exactly what kind of team you have at this point, opening weekend, opening on the road. Georgia Southern's a pretty good mid-major team, usually has good pitching, has some Omaha history in their deal. And, he comes up in I believe it's the 11th or 12th inning and hits a grand slam on Sunday, gives Tennessee the win. I mean, that kind of started things, I guess, a little bit for Tennessee. One, to show what kind of player that he is, but also kind of gives Tennessee that momentum that, hey, we're never out of a game. We can always win these games. And he kind of seemed to be like the spark plug early in the year to get this offense rolling and keep, not an offense that you look up and down the lineup and go, well, this guy can beat you. This guy can beat – you don't want to pitch to this guy. You don't want to pitch to this guy. But kind of like the whole lineup, at certain points in the game, can turn you over and beat you. And he looked like he was kind of a spark early in the year for that.
Yeah, and that's a perfect point as well, Barry, for the fact that at the start of the season, Max Ferguson is one of the 5 on the roster that earned some preseason All-American notifications and notice. In fact, Max Ferguson was the most decorated preseason when it comes to Tennessee's roster. But Tony Vitello was looking at Max as a leadoff hitter. And in fact, there was, I think it was that game that Liam didn't even start. He wanted to get a look at Logan Steenstra. So they decided to go, and Ferguson started in center field. Things weren't going well earlier, as there were a couple of plays that they failed to make that you thought they should have. So Spence goes in at short. Ferguson comes in from center to second. And then in that 12th inning, Tennessee just loads the bases. Georgia Southern was the one that scored first. Tennessee matched it. Then Georgia Southern went back out in front. Tennessee matched it. So they had played catch-up more than anything. And so you load the bases in that 12th inning, and you're just looking for that fly ball that gives you the lead. And the ball had not been doing a great job of carrying in Statesboro that weekend. And yet, lo and behold, he steps into one, and it looked more like a line drive than one of those, I guess, customary home run balls. But it just continued to rise, and it continued to carry, and somehow it made its way over the center fence. I was as surprised as anybody in watching the action, because I thought this was ticketed for a sacrifice fly and going to get the lead, and everybody else was going to be able to move up to where you could build on it a little bit. But lo and behold, cleared the fence, and it was the first really great moment for this team to be able to finish off a quality opponent at their place, which is what Tony Vitello had hoped for, that it would be, they hoped, a little bit warmer at Georgia Southern than it would have been in Knoxville in that third weekend in February. And yet it really did give Tennessee that huge spark that finished off the sweep, and also, I think, allowed Tony Vitello to move Spence more into that leadoff hitter role where he has been so strong and so consistent. But yeah, that kind of came out of nowhere. And I had joked with him. I said, you may not have the quantity, but you sure have quality, because the first home run was the grand slam. The second home run was his first ever SEC at bat. And so he just found a way to make big things happen with each home run. And then he got a third home run in the SEC tournament that helped Tennessee put away Alabama in that contest. and then had 2 home runs for Tennessee in that winner's bracket game as the Vols scored the first 7 against Liberty. So he is not somebody that you would point to and say he's going to come up and hit the dinger, but he is somebody who, when he does, it's usually very, very impactful.
John, we'll wrap it up here in a couple of minutes. And I guess the last thing I had before I turn it over to Barry, the LSU-Tennessee series is fascinating because I got the sense watching from afar and listening to people up there talk, that was a little bit of a litmus test. Now, LSU's season did not go in the direction we thought, but LSU was a preseason Omaha contender and a brand name. And when Tennessee wins that series, and of course you had all the stuff afterwards with Paul Maneri and the things with the crowd, that drew a lot of headlines, but that was kind of one of the first signs that the switch had flipped, and Tennessee had gone from the hunter maybe to the start of the hunted. Well, now we get into postseason. Tennessee definitely is the hunted. It's the number 3 national seed. LSU was the underdog, not expected to be here. Just talk about the dynamics of that series. I thought Tennessee handled the pressure well. I was a little worried about that for the Vols. Especially given a brutal regional matchup, which frankly was an unfair draw for Tennessee. But credit them for getting through it and persevering. Now Tennessee will be the prohibitive favorite, and rightfully so in this one. Just talk about the dynamics of Tennessee handling that as that is flipped. It is just really weird to see an LSU-Tennessee series where LSU, I guess, would be the prohibitive underdog. But just talk about how the dynamics of that have flipped and how Tennessee handles the pressure of being the team that is expected to move on from here.
Well, I think those are all great points as well as fair questions. And I do think that when Tennessee made it down to Hoover as the Eastern Division champs, and for the first time since '97, and then they lose, they thought they had won at one point with a run scored in a walk-off fashion in the bottom of the 9th against Alabama. But then you go back and the play at second is reviewed, and as the second base umpire called interference on Max Ferguson, they played on. Alabama got the emotional win. They got to send Tennessee to the losers bracket, and you're thinking, okay, you've got 2 teams that are going to square off. You thought they might meet, but not by any means in the very first elimination game. The 2 seed in the tournament, Tennessee, against the 3 seed Mississippi State, and then Tennessee just jumps out to the early lead and builds and run rules Mississippi State as the Bulldogs suffered their 3rd straight run rule defeat in Hoover. But I just think that this team has had such a good ability to just go out and focus on the task at hand. It's a paraphrase of what Pat Sump used to say, but Tony Vitello loves to tell his team, just be where your cleats are. And I think they do such a good job of that I don't think they're worried about a big picture. I don't think necessarily they think about games 2 and 3. As he likes to say, especially when they head on the road, you know what? We just want to get to this town and have our Thursday practice and get that practice and make it a good one. And then on Friday, let's be 1-0. I think that is something that serves this team well. But at the same time, again, it is a fair point. Tennessee knew going into the regional that you had Wright State as the 4 seed, which many said could have been a 2 seed, perhaps as high as a 2 seed in some other regionals. But that was just how it worked out. Tennessee played Liberty, lost to Liberty in the first game in the Chapel Hill Regional in 2019, and then won in extras to advance to the regional game, regional final against North Carolina, which the Tar Heels won. They won that first one to end Tennessee's season. And so you had Liberty, a quality opponent there at the number 3, and then you had Duke, which had won 12 straight games and just wiped out the ACC tournament to win that championship and punch its ticket as the 2 seed to the Knoxville Regional. It was thought that while Tennessee was the favorite, they might have their hands full, but Tennessee answered each challenge, albeit a very late one, incredibly dramatic and hugely emotional in the walk-off grand slam against Wright State to avoid the losers bracket in their own regional at home. But that's kind of been, like I said, the mindset. That LSU series was really, when you think about it and you just think series sweep week 2, and it really was a struggle for the Tigers out of the chute because they played just a massively front-loaded schedule because after they lost all 3 to Tennessee, they go home and they get Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt won all 3. So it looked like LSU was just an afterthought. But in that matchup in Knoxville, it was still very limited seating in terms of COVID, so there were about 3,000 fans on hand. And when you have really that few fans collectively in the stands, those that are the loudest and the most boisterous, you'll hear them much more than you would when it is a bigger crowd. You hear the individuals more so than you hear the crowd. And so there were some things that were directed towards the LSU dugout that Paul Maneri was not a fan of, thought they were just some very nasty things that were said. But the crowd was into it because LSU is such a name. And LSU had the lead in the first game. Tennessee came back after the early deficit, won 3-1. And then, even though Evan Russell has 3 home runs, Tennessee trails late in the game against LSU. And then the game is suspended on Saturday as rain started to fall. LSU wasn't happy with that decision, but the game was suspended. They resume it Sunday morning, and it was Drew Gilbert who came up with a 2-out double in the bottom of the ninth, tie the game, and get it to extras. Tennessee missed on an opportunity to win in the 10th. They had loaded the bases, but weren't able to score. And then one of the walk-off home runs, Drew Gilbert hits one that went just over the fence, actually caught the fence behind the protective fence, and came back onto the field. So the right fielder throws it back into second. Gilbert actually stopped on his home run trot because the ball was there on the infield. It was the first base umpire that had to signal that it was indeed a home run. But Tennessee wins that game walk-off fashion, and because you complete the suspended game, it was supposed to be a 7-inning contest. And while Tennessee led, I think it was 1-0 or 2-0, and then LSU tied it late, in an extra 8th inning, Luke Lipsius came up with the walk-off single that gave Tennessee 2 walk-offs in that weekend. So it was very hotly contested. It wasn't one team dominating the other. And then to have Paul Maneri say after he left Knoxville, and perhaps he felt more comfortable because he didn't think he would ever be back in Knoxville again, but he said what he said about the fans being nasty and perhaps the team being classless and how it celebrated some things and perhaps could have handled other things better. And obviously, he's not going to turn to his own, but it's not as though the fan base was as friendly as you would expect. Or, anybody who's had LSU fans at their place know that they're going to be loud in their support, their great support of their team. But we'll just say there was more color to their language than just purple and gold. So they did their own fair share of dropping in some serious, we'll just say, adult language. But you have everything that comes after that, and perhaps it was just Maneri trying to show his young team, I've got your back. And for them to battle the way they did through the season, much better in the second half than they were in the first, they at least gave themselves a chance to make the NCAA tournament. They were rewarded with a bid, and even after losing their first game out in Eugene, they rallied, staving off elimination 4 straight games to win that regional and punch their ticket to come back to Knoxville, which was the only, I believe, super regional possible in terms of who made what regionals that would pit an SEC team against another SEC school. So you have all that as the backdrop, what I think is going to be a wonderfully and hard competition weekend that is upcoming on Saturday. But I just think that Tennessee has done such a good job of again, being where their cleats are to where they know they can't worry about or count their chickens before they're hatched for a game 2, maybe, and Tony Vitello said it specifically in his comments earlier this week. Don't tell me we're 2 wins from Omaha, because 2 wins is a lot. And even though it is just 2 wins and winning a weekend, as Tennessee did 8 out of its 10 SEC series, I think that that's the perfect message for his team. Make sure you do what you have to do to win the first one, and then that gives you the opportunity to punch your ticket to Omaha with a second win. But I do think that he's fully aware of what this LSU team can do, and I also think LSU is fully aware of what Tennessee can do. So I think there is mutual respect, even though there have been some harsh word swaps back and forth. But I do expect the crowd to be potentially a factor, because you go from having 3,000 fans for that first weekend, the full weekend, to now having as many potentially as 5,000 fans each game. I do think that this could be a much more difficult environment in Knoxville than it was in Eugene. But I also know that you're going to have 2 teams that are literally fighting for their seasons to continue. So it should just be a whole lot of fun, and I can't wait to see it, because Tennessee played at Kinston, North Carolina in 2001, in Atlanta in 2005, and this is the first time they've ever hosted a Super, which makes it so much more special.
Does it make it more special that it's an SEC foe coming in and LSU? And this is a nugget on LSU that I thought was pretty neat. in the 64 team bracket era since 1999, LSU's just the fourth team and second road team to be shut out in their regional opener and come back and win the regional with 4 straight elimination game wins. 2008 was Florida State. They defeated Tulane. 2014, Louisiana Lafayette came back and defeated Mississippi State. In 2018, Duke lost their shutout in their opener and came back and beat Georgia in 2018. And now you've got LSU doing it 3 years later. It's a familiar team for Tennessee to play, but the brand team, the 15-time super regional appearance LSU, the intimidator that you have in right field. I mean, how excited is the town of Knoxville, or the city of Knoxville? How excited is this Tennessee fan base to know that not only are we hosting our first super regional ever, but we're hosting our first super regional ever against the program in the SEC and LSU.
Yeah, when it comes to postseason history, none is bigger, none is brighter, and it is one of those teams that you see early on that even though you won the series, and in Tennessee's case all 3, that would be a team that you would much rather have played early rather than late. And to see some of the young guys, Cruz, of course, coming into his own, Morgan at first base, I just really think they've got some guys that are going to power that program through the transition from Paul Mainieri to whichever coach is the next one to take over. I do think that maybe where it's going to take the lineup to carry where they are a little thinner in their pitching staff. They lost one of their top arms, their Saturday starter, early, not long after they left Knoxville. So I do know that perhaps it's not as deep when it comes to their starting rotation, but they've had some guys, I think, like Hilliard step in and step up. So I think it is a little bit different, but I think LSU knows it's in that position where even though it has that kind of history on its side, it's playing with house money. I mean, they're not necessarily expected to win, but they have the opportunity to win and make a very special exit for Paul Mainieri and all that he's meant to that program, having led them to a national championship. So I think when you have young guys that are bought in, that have seen success, that have fought through some really, really hard times and some not LSU-esque series and SEC standings. I thought, for instance, that when they lost to Georgia on that single elimination Tuesday, that was a kind of a win and you're in. I was a little surprised that Georgia didn't make it and LSU did, simply for that last taste of one team on the bubble beating another team on the bubble. But LSU was able to get into the tournament, and as you mentioned, to overcome not just the loss, but being shut out, and to share. I mean, it doesn't take long to call that roll. I think this is a fully confident team, and to overcome not one but 2 deficits against Oregon in that last game in that regional, again, shows you the determination they have. To look like somebody like Bianco, who goes into the weekend, into the regional, not really being a factor, gets his first taste of action in the infield and then moves into center when there's injury. I just think that those are kind of those moments where you look back and you almost always count on there being a heroic effort from somebody who's not even in the picture at the start of a weekend like that, but they sure are a big part of it in the end. And his home run and his great defensive play in the outfield certainly was a big, big step forward for LSU to win and make its way to Knoxville. So, yeah, I do think that LSU is, again, fully confident because it just 4 straight games were able to push aside the end of their season and the end of Paul Mainieri and in his term in Baton Rouge. And for Tennessee, because of his comments from their visit in March, you've got a fan base that would love nothing more than to usher him into the next phase of his life, and that is retirement. So, again, I just think you have both sides that are going to be ultra competitive, and I do think that Tennessee is the favored team, and I think they're ready to go out and play like it. Doesn't mean that guarantees any kind of a win, but I just think that you're going to have 2 teams that, until you get that last out, are going to fight until that last breath.
John, go ahead, Barry. I'll let you finish up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one last question. This may get personal for John, but I know you've done this for a long time. You and I have been friends for a long, long time, and I'm as excited for you about what's going on for Tennessee as anybody. 63 wins the last 2 years, and you've been through some good times with Tennessee and some not so good times, and now hosting your first Super Regional. What is going through John Wilkerson's mind here in the next couple of days, and also I want you to share the story with our audience. When Tennessee wins, your booming voice comes across the Vol network with "Hello Win" column, and I know where that came from, but share that with our listeners as well, and what's going through John Wilkerson's mind as Tennessee prepares to host its first Super Regional, just for you personally, because I know how much Tennessee baseball means to you.
Well, it continues to be an absolute pleasure and the most enjoyment that I get out of anything I'm blessed to do, because this goes back to Rod Delmonico's second season. And I started first just as the PA guy at Lower Hudson Field. It was 2 years before Lindsey Nelson Stadium's gates opened for the first time. But Rod had approached me and asked if I wouldn't do their PA, and so I did that. And then Mike Keith, the voice of the Titans, he was calling Tennessee baseball games, and he gave me the opportunity to travel with him. So I would do the PA for the home games, and then on the road, I would slide into those middle innings. And so just like the classic split where it was Ernie Johnson and Pete Van Wieren and Skip Carey, where you had the play-by-play guy do the first 3 innings and the last 3 innings, I got to do the middle innings for the road games, and I truly loved that. And so Mike and I did more and more work together, and then when Mike became the voice of the Titans, I went into that role, which was a little more than 22 years ago, and so I've just been blessed to see a lot of good baseball, and just also appreciate those that tried to keep Tennessee to that standard, even though the success wasn't there. And for one of the things I appreciate most about 2019, that return to the NCAA tournament for the first time since 2005, and this year getting back to a Super Regional for the first time since 2005, it highlights what Tennessee had with Rod Delmonico in his 18 seasons, 699 wins. He has 2 of Tennessee's 3 SEC championships, led Tennessee to each Eastern Division tournament championship that there was, and then also took Tennessee from a trip to the College World Series in 51 to 4 trips with 95, 01, and 05. So anything that highlights Todd Helton and his team, Chris Burke and his team, and Luke Hochaver, Chase Headley, and that team, I just think it's wonderful because those guys meant the world to me. And it's also really interesting to now have seen them become adults and parents and do the next thing for them after either lengthy baseball careers or the immediate move into becoming a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer or different things like that. So I always have enjoyed the opportunity just to be a part of telling Tennessee's baseball story. So I always appreciated whether there was great success or perhaps even those years where you came up short. But I do, it was something that developed back when I was a kid. I would get the Sporting News preseason manual, and it would list all of the flagship stations in the front of the magazine. And I would just get that front corner of our living room in Knoxville, which got the best AM radio reception. I would find out which games I could pick up. And one of the ones that I could locate was in Fort Worth, and that was WBAP 820 on your AM dial. And I got to hear Mark Holt call Texas Rangers baseball games. And I just loved the way that he finished things with Hello Win column. And so I listened. It was appointment listening for me. And as I was able to go deeper into my time with Tennessee, Mark unfortunately fell ill, and as he was battling leukemia, he died of complications from a surgery, and so he passed away in '97. And it wasn't immediate, but as I went deeper into my time with the Vols, it was probably in the 2000s that I just thought that it would be a neat tribute to him and how he shaped how I call a game, how I watch a game. And I'd had the opportunity to meet Mark on 2 occasions. I went up to Cleveland and got a press pass to watch the Rangers and the Indians, and that was the first time I got to meet him, and he could not have been more gracious. And then I actually got to sit in his booth when I saw him again in Seattle, and he said, just hang out with us. And so there were 3 tiers to that booth in the Kingdome, And I was on that third one, and I could just close my eyes, and it was like I was listening on my radio at home. But he could not have been more gracious or more kind, and so he was really such a kind individual. But I just thought there would be no better way than a tribute to him to that when Tennessee wins to go ahead and echo Hello Win column. So I did that for a good long while, and as Tennessee started with Tony Vitello to start to make that more of a common occurrence, there were some graphics guys that fixed me up with some really neat stuff that I could tweet out when Tennessee won. And then Sean Barrows, who's the SID in his fourth year with the Tennessee baseball program. He's been at Tennessee longer than that, but he has taken to that to where it's such a big moment when Tennessee wins. He says that, and I know that Mark is smiling at all of this because it's still such a big part of the vernacular for the Rangers. But since it was down in Texas and we were up in Tennessee, I thought that it would be okay to tribute Mark as well as opposed to borrow from the Rangers what they celebrate a win with.
The John, are the Rangers your team?
They were. That's a long story. The Yankees traded Chris Chambliss, which made me a free agent way back when. So because I was listening to the Rangers game, they became my team. But when they said that Alex Rodriguez was going to lead them to their first World Series title, and then they traded him 2 weeks later, that's when I said, okay, that's enough. You can't just lie to me like that. So they did lose my fandom as my favorite team, but they'll always have a place in my heart for how long I did follow them.
Well, anybody that listens to AM radio to baseball games is a man after my own heart. I grew up on TBS and the Atlanta Braves, and I would watch the Cubs in the afternoon, and I just think baseball people have a special bond, and I can tell you're one of those, sir.
Well, I sure do appreciate it. I very much enjoyed being on with you guys, and that's one of the things that just allows people to share the game to an even greater degree. And so to have been in Dodger Stadium and to be able to hear Vin Scully as he's calling a game, I mean, there are just so many legendary voices that it really is an experience. And so I just think that it's one of those things that when you get to do what we all do in following the sport that we love, anything that adds depth and color to it is something that you can share. And I think that's what helps the game grow and makes it special.
Well, you're great at your job. We could follow you, I know, on your Twitter handle, J. Wilkerson WNML, where I know you were posting some of the highlights and things of the broadcasts as they go. But I want to give you the floor to promote anything that you and the school are doing as far as baseball. Tell folks where they can listen to your call this weekend and all those things before we close the show.
Well, we've been blessed to have the ability to carry Tennessee baseball all these years on Sports Radio WNML, and so it's 99.1 thesportsanimal.com. You can listen that way, or it might be an easier patch to go to utsports.com. You can find the link there, or you can download the Game Day app, the UT Game Day app, and that allows you to also carry it with you wherever you go. But it is going to be so exciting. And I also think it's great irony that the first Tennessee team to ever play in a Super Regional had Chris Burke, and Chris is such a natural and does such a great job working for the SEC Network and ESPN that he's going to be on the call for the first Super Regional at Lindsey Nelson Stadium. Unfortunately, he won't be on hand, but he will be a part of it, and I know he'll be so proud of these guys as they continue to try and write their own page of Tennessee history and do what no team has ever done, and that's punch their ticket to Omaha from a Super Regional in Knoxville. Todd Helton and his team, they did win a Knoxville Regional to get to the College World Series when it was a 48-team field. But this will be the first group of Tennessee Volunteers, if they can get two against LSU, to win a Super Regional in Knoxville and make themselves the fifth team to wear the orange and white in Omaha.
Well, Chris does an outstanding job as well. I enjoy listening to both of you guys. But anyway, John, thank you for joining us today. Best of luck to the Vols this weekend.
Sure do appreciate it. Really enjoy the opportunity to talk with you. And, of course, Barry, always great to cross paths with you.
John, it's always a pleasure, buddy. I appreciate it. I wish you and the Vols all the best this weekend. I'm really happy for you.
Sure do appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Thursday episode of the 14th. Friday, we'll have Jim Ellis from Mississippi State as we will talk about the Bulldog season, and we will also discuss their matchup with Notre Dame. Anyway, thank you again to John Wilkerson of the Vol Network for joining us. Thank you to my co-host, Barry Allen. I'm Chris Lee, host of the 14. Thank you for listening. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. You can pick that up at Apple Podcasts or just about anywhere you get them. Just search for Southeastern 14 or The 14. Anyway, rating, reviewing, subscribing, all those things help us, and we would appreciate if you do that. For Chris Lee and for Barry Allen, for John Wilkerson, thank you for listening to us today. We'll see you again on Friday.